I wouldn't have said so, no. Not really. But no, I don't get the feeling that she's wildly optimistic about life. A pragmatist, I think.
The moment was not loud. There was no public announcement, no grand palace speech, no sweeping statement released beneath the royal crest. It began in a private room, with a folder placed on polished wood, and Queen Camilla watching every face around the table turn unnaturally still. Then the lawyers confirmed the decision. Princess Anne would inherit Queen Elizabeth's Balmoral collection, and Camilla's expression collapsed before anyone could save the silence. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Camilla did not move at first. She kept her eyes on the folder as if the words might change if she stared long enough. The Balmoral collection, the late Queen's private group of personal objects, keepsakes, furniture, jewels, and treasured items connected to her life in Scotland, was not being passed to the Queen Consort. It was going to Anne. Not as a temporary guardian. Not as someone asked to hold it until another arrangement could be made. The legal confirmation made Anne the direct inheritor, and every person in that room understood why that mattered. Balmoral was not just a royal residence. It was the place where Elizabeth had been most herself, far from the heavy rhythm of London, far from the endless demands of the crown. To inherit what she kept there was to inherit something far deeper than possessions. It was to inherit trust. Charles watched Camilla's face change, and the king seemed to lose the words he had brought into the room. He reached for his glasses, removed them slowly, then set them beside the file without speaking. That silence cut harder than any argument. Camilla had expected recognition, perhaps even a quiet sign that Elizabeth's most intimate legacy would now fold naturally into her own household. Instead, the lawyers had delivered a sentence that placed her outside the late Queen's private world. She had the title, she had the position, she had the public place beside Charles. But this decision whispered something colder. There were doors Elizabeth had never opened fully. Anne sat with a stillness that made the room even heavier. She did not look shocked. She did not ask for the wording to be repeated. The princess listened like someone receiving a burden she already knew was coming, and that calmness struck Camilla with brutal force. The legal wording, the formal language that decides who controls a private royal inheritance, left no space for challenge, no soft corner for negotiation. Elizabeth's wishes had been protected carefully, locked behind precise instructions, long before anyone in the room expected them to matter. Camilla finally pushed her chair back. The sound was small, but it landed like a crack across the table. A courtier near the door lowered his eyes, but not before noticing the one thing no one dared say aloud. Anne had not been surprised, and if Anne had known, then this was not merely a legal decision. It was a final message from Elizabeth herself. But to understand why this decision struck Camilla so deeply, the story must move beyond the legal file and into the lives of the people whose loyalties were suddenly laid bare. This was never only about a collection. It was about belonging. It was about who Queen Elizabeth trusted with the private pieces of her life, and who she kept at a careful distance, even after years of public acceptance. For Camilla, the decision felt like a final judgment. For Princess Anne, it felt like a duty. And between them stood Charles, trapped between his wife's pain and his mother's unmistakable will. Camilla understood the wound before anyone explained it. The Balmoral collection, those private pieces tied to Elizabeth's life in Scotland, from treasured keepsakes to personal room furnishings and family objects, carried a meaning no public crown could match. It was not valuable simply because it belonged to a monarch. It mattered because it belonged to the woman behind the throne. The Queen Consort had spent years standing beside Charles, attending services, greeting crowds, carrying the weight of acceptance one public appearance at a time. Yet in one legal sentence, Elizabeth's private world had gone elsewhere. Camilla could wear the crown, but this decision made her feel as though she had never truly crossed the final threshold. Anne felt the weight differently. The princess had never chased softness from the public, and she had never built her place in the family through charm. She had earned it through discipline, silence, and duty repeated until it became part of her bones. To her, Balmoral was not a prize. It was memory under protection. Elizabeth had trusted her with something fragile, and Anne knew that kind of trust could not be celebrated like a victory. It had to be carried with restraint. That was why she stood by the window after the meeting, holding the legal note with both hands, her face steady but not untouched. She folded the paper once, carefully, as if even the crease needed respect. Charles stood close enough to hear her breath shift. The king had spent his life between emotion and obligation, but this time the split was crueler. Private inheritance, the passing of personal property after death rather than official royal power, had separated his wife from his mother's deepest confidence. Elizabeth had drawn a line between public rank and private trust, and Charles could not pretend the line was accidental. When Anne told him that their mother knew exactly what she was doing, he looked away. Not because he disagreed, because he knew she was right. William studied the same decision with a quieter fear. The prince saw more than family pain. He saw a warning about the future monarchy, about what kind of loyalty would matter when titles were no longer enough. Camilla had status. Anne had trust. Charles had silence. And somewhere between them, Elizabeth's choice began to feel less like inheritance and more like a message waiting to be decoded. And the answer to Elizabeth's choice was not hidden in the document itself, but in a single moment at Balmoral that quietly changed everything. Every royal rupture has a beginning, but the most dangerous ones rarely announce themselves. This one began at Balmoral, during a private family dinner that was supposed to be peaceful. The late queen listened more than she spoke. Camilla made one remark too many. Anne noticed. Charles froze. And by the end of the evening, Elizabeth had seen enough to make a decision that would outlive them all. The room changed after Camilla placed her glass down. She spoke with the confidence of someone who believed the future had already accepted her, saying that certain private rooms at Balmoral should not remain untouched forever. Balmoral, the Scottish royal home long tied to Elizabeth's most personal family life, mattered because it was where the monarch had stepped away from public duty and lived closest to memory. The Balmoral lamplight dinner, as one documented palace account later called it, was meant to be a quiet family meal, not a turning point. Yet Charles heard the words and lowered his eyes. Anne heard them and went still. William heard them and understood, even before anyone spoke again, that something sacred had been disturbed. Elizabeth did not answer quickly. She looked first at Camilla, then at Anne, and the silence pressed down harder than a rebuke. The queen had guarded those rooms because they carried pieces of her marriage, her children's younger years, and the private rhythm of a life the public never fully saw. Camilla's remark may have sounded practical, but to Elizabeth it landed like a claim made too soon, as if memory could be rearranged before grief had even been allowed to breathe. Anne sensed the hurt immediately. The princess tightened her hand around her napkin, not in anger alone, but in protection. Charles tried to soften the damage. The king, still a son in that room more than a monarch, began to say that Camilla only meant the rooms might need care one day. But the words came too late. Elizabeth turned toward him with a calmness that stopped him before he could finish. Then she asked one quiet question. Should a personal legacy serve comfort, or should it protect continuity? No one mistook the meaning. The queen was no longer speaking about rooms. She was speaking about trust. William said nothing, but the prince watched the table like a future king, learning a lesson he would never forget. Camilla had spoken from confidence. Anne had responded with restraint. Charles had tried to rescue peace. Elizabeth had measured them all. That was the hidden source of the later decision, the private spark behind the legal fire that would one day leave Camilla shattered. Elizabeth acted before the night fully ended. According to the documented account prepared later for a senior royal advisor, she summoned her private secretary, the senior aide responsible for handling confidential royal papers, and asked for the Balmoral collection documents to be reviewed. That request did not sound dramatic. It did not need to. It quietly set the legal path toward Anne's inheritance and placed a shield around the late queen's most personal world. That single dinner became the ghost inside the legal decision, and when Camilla finally understood it, restraint gave way to confrontation. By the time Camilla reached Anne, the palace had already changed temperature. Corridors seemed narrower. Voices dropped faster. Aides moved out of the way. Camilla wanted an explanation, not from the lawyers, not from the private secretaries, but from the woman whose name now stood where she believed hers should have been. When the door closed behind them, the monarchy's polished restraint cracked into something raw. Camilla stepped inside, without waiting for comfort. She had requested the private meeting after learning the inheritance decision could not be easily challenged, and that mattered because it stripped away the last hope of quiet correction. A private meeting, in royal terms, meant a conversation without staff speaking for either side, without official notes shaping every word, and without the soft protection of palace procedure. Charles had chosen not to attend. The king's absence left the two women alone with the real wound. Elizabeth had not merely chosen Anne. She had chosen Anne in a way that Camilla could not undo. Anne stood near the fireplace, still and guarded. The princess did not rush to explain herself, and that calmness sharpened the air. Camilla asked whether she had enjoyed seeing her name placed above hers in the papers, whether she had enjoyed watching the queen consort humiliated by a decision wrapped in her mother's memory. Anne's face did not harden. It settled. That was worse. She told Camilla that their mother's wishes were not a weapon, and she would not pretend they were one simply to make the pain easier to bear. Camilla flinched at the word mother. She knew Anne had the right to say it, but in that moment the word became a wall. The queen consort had spent years standing beside Charles, learning the rhythm of duty, enduring the whispers, carrying herself through ceremonies where acceptance always seemed close but never complete. Anne had never needed to ask for that place. She had been born inside it. And now Elizabeth's Balmoral collection, the private pieces tied to the late Queen's most personal life in Scotland, had become proof of that difference. Anne finally revealed the deeper fear through a recorded conversation, later preserved in a confidential family account. Elizabeth had worried that Balmoral's private objects could become symbols of status instead of remembrance. The Queen had seen how easily memory could be polished into display, how quickly grief could become possession, and she had wanted protection before anyone dared call it necessary. Camilla heard it and understood at once. This decision had not been improvised after Elizabeth's death. It had been shaped while the monarch was still watching them all. Camilla's anger thinned into something more exposed. She looked at Anne and saw no victory, no smugness, no hunger. She saw certainty. That certainty wounded her more than accusation ever could. Anne had not taken the collection from her. Elizabeth had placed it beyond her reach. The door opened again, but nothing felt released. Camilla walked out shaken, carrying the confrontation like a bruise beneath silk, while Anne remained behind with the stillness of someone who had defended a duty she never asked to receive. But Anne's composure was only the surface. Beneath it lay a legal design so precise that even Charles could not easily disturb it. The real power in the room was not the crown, not the title, not even the king's personal preference. It was the wording. Line by line, Elizabeth had created a barrier around Balmoral's private collection, separating sentiment from ambition and memory from rank. Charles could ask questions. Camilla could protest. Courtiers could whisper. But the document did not tremble. It stood exactly where Elizabeth had placed it. Charles read the clause twice. He did not call for an aid, and he did not ask anyone to soften the language. The clause, a legal section inside a document that explains exactly how an instruction must be followed, made the decision brutally clear. Elizabeth's private Balmoral pieces were not to be redistributed, reinterpreted, or moved into ceremonial use for the queen consort's household. That mattered because it removed every polite escape route. Camilla could not call the decision a misunderstanding. Charles could not call it unfinished. Anne was not simply receiving objects. She was receiving control, responsibility, and the authority to guard what Elizabeth had personally marked as untouchable. Camilla felt the walls closing in without anyone raising a voice. The queen consort understood the trap immediately. If she pushed back, she would look as if she were challenging Elizabeth's memory. If she stayed silent, the wound would stand as truth. The wording had turned grief into law, and law into humiliation. Charles knew it too. The king sat alone with the papers after the lawyers left, feeling the impossible pull between husband and son. He wanted to comfort Camilla, but every line in the file seemed to carry his mother's hand. To defend his wife too strongly would feel like undoing Elizabeth. To defend Elizabeth too clearly would leave Camilla abandoned. William saw the deeper message before most people dared speak it. The prince studied the decision not as a family quarrel, but as a lesson in stewardship, the duty of protecting something valuable for the future, instead of using it for personal status. Anne's role as inheritor and guardian meant she held both ownership and responsibility, and that combination gave her quiet power. She was not being rewarded with glitter. She was being trusted with memory. William understood why that mattered for the monarchy. A crown could command attention, but restraint could command belief. Charles set the file down with 2 fingers, as though the paper itself had become too heavy. He stared at the final line and did not move. Elizabeth had spoken more forcefully in death than many monarchs do in life, and the king knew the decision could not be softened without breaking something sacred. Camilla remained trapped outside the wording. Anne stood protected inside it. William carried the lesson forward. And when the first inventory list arrived from Balmoral, the decision stopped being theory and became a visible transfer of power. The fallout did not begin with shouting. It began with boxes, carefully labeled, quietly moved, respectfully handled. Yet to Camilla, each sealed crate felt like a public verdict carried through private halls. Balmoral was no longer a place of possibility for her. It had become evidence. And as the first pieces were prepared for Anne's custody, the Queen Consort understood that exclusion could be silent and still devastating. Camilla paused at the end of the corridor as two staff members carried the first sealed case past her. She did not ask what was inside. She already knew enough. The formal transfer process, the careful legal movement of inherited items from one person's authority to another, had begun under Anne's name, and that mattered because it turned Elizabeth's private decision into action. No longer was the inheritance only a sentence in a file. It now had weight, labels, signatures, and movement. Each box proved that Anne's authority was not symbolic. It was active. Anne signed the receiving papers with a heaviness no one could mistake for pride. The princess looked down at the inventory list, then paused before placing her name on the line. An inventory list, in plain terms, is the written record of every item being moved, checked, and protected. This one carried more than descriptions. It carried Elizabeth's private life. Items connected to her sitting room, her quiet habits, her personal mornings, and her years at Balmoral were being catalogued under Anne's direction. She did not treat it like a win. She treated it like grief that required discipline. Camilla watched from a distance, and the distance became the wound. The Queen Consort had stood beside Charles in public, walked through crowds, carried the pressure of a complicated past, and endured years of judgment to reach a place of official acceptance. Yet here, in the private machinery of inheritance, she remained outside. That was why the boxes hurt. They did not shout rejection, they performed it. They moved past her with quiet respect, and that quiet made the humiliation harder to bear. A sealed case changed everything. One label connected it to Elizabeth's private sitting room, the same room at the heart of the Balmoral lamplight dinner. Camilla saw the marking and felt the old conversation return like a hand closing around her throat. A courtier later noted in a documented palace account that Elizabeth had personally marked certain objects for Anne years earlier, proving the choice had roots deeper than the final legal review. The Queen had not reacted in panic. She had prepared. Charles received the update before evening. The king read the transfer note once, then held it longer than necessary. He knew Camilla was hurting. He knew Anne was obeying. He knew Elizabeth's judgment stood between them like stone. Camilla's hand had lifted slightly as the case passed her, then fallen back to her side. Anne's signature had made the transfer real, and Charles now faced the question he could no longer avoid. But the transfer of objects was only the visible wound. The deeper question was whether Charles would finally speak as a husband or remain silent as a son. There are moments when royalty offers no protection at all. No crown can soften a private rejection. No title can turn a mother's final decision into something less personal. That evening, Charles and Camilla sat without aides, without papers, without ceremony. For the first time since the lawyers spoke, she did not ask what could be changed. She asked him what Elizabeth had truly believed about her. Camilla sat across from Charles with no jewels, no formal armor, only a tired stillness in her face. The king had arranged the conversation after the Balmoral transfer began, and that mattered because the decision had moved beyond law into marriage. A private royal conversation, in simple terms, meant no officials shaping the words, no advisors protecting the pauses, and no palace machinery standing between pain and truth. Camilla no longer wanted a legal route. She wanted an answer from the man who had known Elizabeth as monarch and mother. Charles looked at her and understood the question before she finished asking it. The Queen Consort wanted to know whether Elizabeth had ever truly trusted her, or whether every smile, every service, every public gesture had covered a line the late Queen never intended to erase. Camilla had survived years of judgment to stand beside him, but the Balmoral collection had touched something no ceremony could heal. It told her that public acceptance was not the same as private belonging, and that difference was now sitting between them like a third person in the room. Charles closed his eyes for a moment before answering. The pause told Camilla almost everything before the words arrived. The king loved her, but he could not rewrite his mother's heart. He told her, through a private recorded conversation later summarized in a confidential family account, that Elizabeth valued loyalty shown through restraint, not loud loyalty, not loyalty that asked to be seen. Anne had given that kind of devotion for decades, steady and unsentimental, and the late queen had recognized it without needing to explain herself to anyone. Camilla absorbed the words slowly. She did not interrupt. She did not defend herself. The queen consort understood that fighting the decision now would only deepen the wound. If she challenged Anne, she would seem to challenge Elizabeth. If she tried to claim Balmoral, she would appear smaller than the legacy she wanted to enter. Charles watched that understanding settle across her face, and it hurt him because he knew the truth had not comforted her. It had only made the rejection clearer. Silence became the turning point. Camilla stopped fighting the document, not because the pain had gone, but because she finally saw the cost of resisting it. Charles remained beside her, yet Elizabeth's judgment remained untouched. Anne still held the trust. The collection still moved under her name. And beyond the palace walls, another force was beginning to gather. Once Camilla stopped fighting the document, the world outside the palace began fighting over what it meant. By morning, the private wound had become a public spectacle. The story escaped the palace gates and landed in breakfast rooms, radio studios, newspaper stands, and crowded pavements outside royal landmarks. People did not see only an inheritance dispute. They saw Elizabeth's final preference, Anne's quiet strength, Camilla's visible pain, and a monarchy still wrestling with memory. Balmoral was no longer just a castle, it was a verdict. Camilla saw the front page before most of the household had finished their morning briefings. A morning broadcaster held up the newspaper on live television, and the headline cut through the screen with cruel simplicity: Elizabeth's final trust. Beneath it sat a large image of Balmoral, and beside it, a smaller photo of Camilla looking strained. The queen consort folded the paper once, placed it face down, and did not finish the article. A front page, in simple terms, is the main newspaper cover that decides what the nation sees first, and this one mattered because it turned her private exclusion into a public judgment. Anne heard about the headline later, but the princess did not react with triumph. She remained composed, yet those close to her saw the burden settling deeper. The public had turned her into the symbol of Elizabeth's final loyalty, and that kind of attention came with danger. If Anne appeared too pleased, people would call it victory. If she appeared too cold, people would call it cruelty. So she chose the only path she knew: restraint. She said little, moved carefully, and let the late queen's decision speak louder than any defense she could offer. Palace officials tried to control the heat. They framed the transfer as continuity and preservation, not rivalry. A palace statement, meaning an official message issued to guide public understanding, carefully avoided emotional language and focused on respect for Elizabeth's wishes. But the public had already found its own story. This was not simply about who received a collection. It was about whether Camilla had ever truly entered Elizabeth's private circle. It was about whether Anne had quietly held the trust others wanted to claim. And it was about whether Charles could protect unity when his mother's final choice had divided feeling from title. Outside Buckingham Palace, a small crowd gathered with phones raised and voices low. One elderly woman, speaking to a broadcaster during a live interview, gave the moment its most painful sentence: "The Queen knew who would protect her heart." The words traveled fast. Camilla heard them later and said nothing. Anne heard them too, and the princess lowered her eyes because praise could feel heavy when it was built from another woman's grief. Charles watched the coverage with a face that betrayed little and carried much. The king knew the monarchy had survived bigger storms, but this one cut differently because it did not come from scandal. It came from memory. William understood that too. The prince saw how quickly the nation had turned Balmoral into a test of trust, and he knew the future crown would have to learn from it. And when the noise finally settled, what remained was not scandal, but a painful truth about inheritance, loyalty, and the limits of royal acceptance. In the end, the Balmoral collection did not simply pass from one royal hand to another. It revealed the emotional map Queen Elizabeth left behind. Anne received the objects, but also the burden. Camilla lost the claim, but gained a brutal clarity. Charles was forced to accept that love could not overturn legacy. And the monarchy learned that even after death, Elizabeth still knew how to make the room fall silent. Anne arrived at Balmoral after the transfer was complete, and the quiet felt heavier than any ceremony. The Balmoral collection, Elizabeth's private group of personal pieces, family objects, room furnishings, keepsakes, and memories tied to her Scottish home, had now become more than an inheritance. It had become a symbol of continuity, not wealth. That mattered because Elizabeth had separated public monarchy from private trust. A person could stand beside the throne and still not be chosen to protect the rooms where the late queen had been most herself. Anne understood that cruel difference, and the princess accepted it without celebration. Camilla understood it too, but for her, the meaning cut deeper. The queen consort was shattered not because she had lost furniture, jewels, or private objects. She was shattered because Elizabeth's decision exposed the boundary that had never fully disappeared between them. Years beside Charles had given her public position, but Balmoral had revealed something more private and more painful. Trust had not followed the crown. Acceptance had not reached every room. Camilla sat quietly after the last public commentary faded, no longer raging, no longer asking what could be changed, only absorbing what the decision had finally confirmed. Charles read the final confirmation and did nothing to disturb it. The king signed nothing, changed nothing, and called for no fresh review. That silence mattered, because it showed that even love had limits when placed against Elizabeth's final wishes. He had wanted to protect Camilla from humiliation, but he could not protect her from truth. He had wanted to honor Anne without deepening the wound, but Elizabeth had already chosen the language, the direction, and the guardian. Charles finally understood that his mother had settled a question he never wanted answered in public. Who held her deepest confidence at Balmoral? William saw the moment as a lesson for the future crown. The prince understood that monarchy does not survive through possession alone. It survives through trust, restraint, and moral memory. Anne touched the back of a chair in one of Elizabeth's private rooms, then removed her hand quickly, as if memory itself deserved permission. The gesture said everything. Being chosen did not mean winning. It meant carrying grief with discipline. The monarchy did not collapse under the weight of the Balmoral decision. It clarified itself. Elizabeth's final act reminded everyone that titles can be granted, ceremonies can be staged, and crowns can be placed before the world. But trust is something different. Trust is earned privately. It is remembered privately. And when Elizabeth chose Anne, she did not merely assign a collection. She delivered a final emotional verdict. Camilla's pain was real. Anne's duty was undeniable. Charles's silence was revealing. And Elizabeth's judgment became the final word. This is where the story ends. Not with another battle, not with another palace whisper, but with Elizabeth's decision standing untouched. Anne carrying the burden, Camilla facing the wound, and the crown learning that the deepest power in monarchy is not possession, it is trust. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.